Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Artur Rehi podcast. Today's guest is the Chancellor of the Estonian Foreign Ministry, Jonatan Vseviov. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for finding the time.
Absolutely.
I have a few questions lined up for you, so I'll shoot away.
Bring it on.
So about a week ago, even less, a few days ago, actually, you came from Ukraine. Can you tell me how was the visit?
Well, first of all, I've been to Ukraine a number of times, but this was the first time since the large-scale invasion started in February. The mood of my interlocutors was extremely positive, focused, determined, just as President Zelensky every night when he addresses the Ukrainian people on TV. They are determined to win. And it's also clear that the Ukrainian people, the people I saw on the streets, they obviously feel the pain of this war. I, this time, only stayed in Kiev. The day I left Kiev, parts of its civilian infrastructure again were hit by Russian missiles. But Kiev itself as a city is not under immediate threat of a ground-based attack. But nevertheless, you feel and you sense that it is a capital city of a country that is in war, in a war for its existence. You can sense it. You can sense the cost of it. But nevertheless, the people know that they need to win. And my understanding was, my sense was that they're extremely confident, with the help of the free world, that they will be able to survive as a nation, as a country, and indeed liberate those parts of their country that are still under occupation. But the city itself, you could obviously sense that it's a town that is in a country that is in war, cold, dark, and yet you can see life clinging on. Restaurants, some of them open, people going about their daily lives, their daily affairs. So it was encouraging but depressing at the same time, because what's going on should not be happening in 21st century Europe. What's happening is absolutely unacceptable. And although this war has now been going on for almost a year, and all of us in the West, we have more or less gotten used to the constant news feed from Ukraine. We should not normalize this. We should not consider this as just another one of the problems that we collectively as humans face. It is absolutely unacceptable, horrifying, illegal, unjustified, and should stop now.
But I agree with you. We should not normalize it. We're so used to it. Me as a military blogger, I wake up to see the videos of people being blown to bits and choosing which one of these videos to show to people. It's normal for me. How to not normalize it?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to not self-censor. War is horrible, and our people need to know what it is like, not only on the front lines, but also in normal Ukrainian cities, where apartment buildings are being blown to bits. Not accidentally, by the way, not accidentally.
No.
Russia's war strategy in Ukraine is aimed at breaking the will of the Ukrainian people through a systematic destruction of their civilian infrastructure, which is a war crime.
Yeah.
We should not accept it as normal. We should keep our eyes open. We should be aware of what is going on. But this is unacceptable. By the way, what is at stake in this war is significantly bigger than just the fate of the Ukrainian people or the country of Ukraine. Russia is attacking every core principle upon which we've built international and European security over the past 70 plus years. every core principle. This war, like all wars, will end with a peace. The way this war ends will define the sort of peace we'll have for at least a generation. If we allow it to become the norm, that under certain circumstances a larger state can veto its neighbor's core foreign and security policy decisions, can change its neighbor's borders with military force, can decide whether a nation has a right to exist or not, and then implement that decision through aggression. If we allow it to become the norm, that for some countries, sovereignty is limited, that for some countries, they need to pick and choose their friends and allies, not according to what they want, but according to what their neighbor wants. If this becomes the norm, then I'm afraid there's not a single border, not a single nation, not a single country that remains safe. Our goal needs to be stated clearly. It is the discreditation of aggression as a tool of statecraft, and the reinforcement and the strengthening of these core principles upon which all of our security rests. When we say territorial integrity, we mean territorial integrity. Sovereignty means sovereignty. Doesn't matter whether you're a neighbor or not. Doesn't matter whether you're a nuclear power or not, whether you're a United Nations Security Council permanent member. No, sovereignty is sovereignty. Territorial integrity is territorial integrity. A nation's right to exist is just that. And you cannot get away with militarily trying to turn back the clock to 19th or early 20th century European history and hope to get away with this. So it is our existential interests that are at stake here as much as Ukraine's. We will be defined by this war, and the peace that follows will determine not just European security, but global security, because the world is watching.
Well, the peace will be determined by the rules when this conflict ends, of course. But in 1918, when Russian Empire fell for the first time, there was a civil war that spilled into Estonia. There was the Estonian Independence War of 1918 to 1920. Which Russia would be safer for Estonia? The one we know now, or the chaos that would come from the dissolvement of this Russia we know now?
That's a very important question. I think there are two things that we need to. There are two separate issues here. One is the immediate problem of the war. The other is our long-term vision of relations with Russia. That is and likely will remain our neighbor, and has always been our neighbor. Our neighbor as Estonians, but our neighbor as Europe's as well. I don't think that we should set ourselves any more ambitious goals than to get Russia back to Russia. That's ambitious enough. We should state clearly that our aim is the full territorial integrity in its internationally recognized borders for Ukraine. That also obviously includes Crimea. We should not hesitate to state it loudly and clearly every single time we talk about what it is that our policy is aimed at. Full sovereignty. No gray zones, because the conflicts of post-Cold War Europe have always, without exception, emanated from artificially created gray zones between the democratic West and Russia, and so on and so forth. That is a pretty significant task. I think we're going to succeed, thanks in large part to the heroics of the Ukrainian armed forces and the resolve of the Ukrainian people, but also thanks to the unity of the West, the resolve of the West, the political will of the West to do what is necessary. We've been doing the right things, oftentimes frustratingly slow. It's understandable. We're democracies. It takes time to build consensus. We're on the right path, but we need to finish the job. Because at the end of the day, what matters is not what we say and not even what we do, but the results that we manage to get. That is what is important. The war is still ongoing, and there should be no other priorities on our list besides defeating this aggression and discrediting aggression as a tool of statecraft. It's doable. We're doing it. It needs to be finished. So then the second question: what kind of a security order do we foresee after hopefully Ukraine manages to liberate all of its territory with our help? Well, first of all, relations with Russia. We should be very, very cautious, move step by step. It's not a question of whether the agreements, the treaties, instruments of international law that Russia voluntarily signed and joined, whether they were good or bad, whether they should be amended or not. The basic question is whether we can trust Russia's signature and Russia's word again. Because they are currently in violation of every agreement, even the most basic ones, with maybe a few exceptions here and there, but the most basic agreements. Now, it's okay to not accept the agreements that were signed 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And there's a process for you to let it be known, and there's usually a process for you to get out of those agreements. That's understandable. But the question is whether we can trust any agreements with a government that currently is in violation of everything. So to build that trust, we need assurances. The democratic world needs assurances. Obviously, Ukraine needs assurances from Russia. From Russia. And in my personal opinion, the only way we can get those assurances is by moving very, very slowly and step by step. Trust, but verify, should be the guiding principle. The worst thing for us to do is to pretend that nothing happened. Just go back, look at all the agreements that we have, all the core documents that Russia is party to, and pretend that what had happened was an error in the system and that now we're just rebooting and going back to how things were before. Because that wouldn't address the main problem. The main problem is the problem of trust. So they broke all of these agreements before. Why would we possibly accept a different outcome in the future? So step by step, very cautiously, taking good care of our own defense and security, investing in NATO, investing in defense, investing politically in the unity of the democratic world, strengthening democracy at home and internationally. This should be our task number one. Secondly, I think it's clear that as we defeat aggression, as we discredit aggression as a tool of statecraft, we also need to ensure that these concepts of territorial integrity and sovereignty that they actually mean something. We cannot even hint at accepting a world of spheres of influence for great power, for great powers, and that means that every country should have a free choice of friends, allies, security policy arrangements, etc., etc. Any sort of an arrangement that ignores this de facto takes us back to an era of spheres of influence, legitimizes the concept of spheres of influences, instead of legitimizing what should be legitimized, which is the concept of sovereignty. We shouldn't fall into that trap. We should not come up with constructs that say that for certain European countries, NATO membership, European Union membership is an option if they so desire, but for others it is not an option because of who knows what geopolitical considerations people might have in third capitals. We should also make sure that we don't accept, or at least that we work towards attracting those who so desire towards our way of life, the European Union and NATO. The existence of gray zones is not beneficial, neither from the perspective of stability nor from the perspective of European and Western interests. So if there is a desire somewhere to become a member state of NATO and the European Union, not only should we keep our doors open politically, we should do everything in our power to help those countries along the way. Estonia regained its freedom in 1991 after having illegally been torn from our rightful place in Europe. We wanted to rejoin not just Europe as a sort of a political concept. We wanted to obviously join all of the Western institutions, and we know how difficult it is for a country that is at the same time trying to rebuild its economy, how difficult it is to meet all the political, economic, military criteria to join these organizations. One can only imagine how difficult it is for countries that have just come out of a war, or for countries that have had parts of their territory, significant parts of their territory occupied by Russian armed forces. So what we should be doing is helping them with these reforms. Judicial reform, anti-corruption reform, building up the state apparatus in a modern and transparent and democratic way, etc., economic reforms. Now, it's one thing to just provide assistance, which obviously we should be doing. It's another thing to provide advice, which sometimes is a double-edged sword. We should be smart enough to do both, and in doing so, we should be smart enough to be guided by a strategic rationale, which is to help do everything in our power to help them to come closer to us. Because if they're not coming towards us, then they will either remain a gray zone, which is going to be a source of military conflict in the future, or they will fall to the other side. The other side is dark. It is opposed to everything we're trying to achieve in the West. So these are some of the things that we should be thinking about when it comes to the long-term future. But I think the main thing is to not pretend that nothing happened and not legitimize what Russia is trying to achieve themselves. A turning back of the clock to an era where great powers decided where their spheres of influence are. By the way, even if somebody were to think that in the West that would be a wise course of action, in this contemporary era of open diplomacy, democratized media, it would come out. It would come out. And it would not be able to sustain political support for any sort of a behind closed doors backroom deal that trades supposed stability for other people's and countries' freedom. Not doable. So we should stay true to our principles.
Well, in Russian armed forces, there is a lot of infighting going on. Prigozhin, Kadyrov, we have these two agents who are not directly part of Russian armed forces, but they're acting on their behalf. But there is then Gerasimov and Shoigu. We have these two people against each other. How possible do you think is a Russian civil war, another one?
Difficult to say. I don't, it's always difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But they are separate agents only from the perspective of their facade. For years, we've been telling people that, look, the Wagner Group is another tool in the Russian regime's toolbox. It is not a private company in the true meaning of the word. Yes, it's not the same institution as the Russian armed forces, but it's the same player or the same actor using these tools. Oftentimes, by the way, with the aim of confusing us. In their operations in Africa, for instance, the attempt was to use military force with a level of plausible deniability to confuse the international community. In this war, Russia is throwing everything that they have at breaking the Ukrainian military, but also breaking the will of the Ukrainian people. So it's natural that all of these so-called private companies are being utilized to their maximum effect. Also, the National Guard, mobilized troops, in addition to every thinkable and unthinkable branch of their conventional armed forces. It does appear that there is a level of infighting in the leadership. A lot of it is public. I think what it really tells us is that there's a level of panic in decision-making circles. There's I think, a realization that not only did the Russian armed forces fail to capture Kiev according to the plans that they had in a few days, but that they're failing strategically. I can only imagine how scary that must be, because it's clear that sooner or later somebody will be blamed for these failures. It's also very clear that the international community has, I believe, reached a point of no return on the question of accountability. The crimes that we've seen, the war crimes, the systematic war crimes, the crime of aggression, we have, I think, reached a point where we have put in motion political processes that sooner or later will lead to international independent judicial proceedings against those that committed those crimes. Now, we might not reach every criminal, we might not reach them soon, but I think we've reached a point of no return where this process, this important element of our policy, cannot neither be ignored nor turned back. The decision makers in Moscow realize this. And I think this is part of the reason why there's a lot of, at least, the things that we see, a lot of moving and shaking in the system.
Should we be glad for it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. They need to be aware of the fact that the world is watching. That and they need to think twice before they give orders to knowingly commit crimes against international law. And hopefully not just think twice, but avoid taking those steps. So the level of concern that we do seem to pick up, I think, is positive. Is it enough? That's a different question. Let's go back to what we want. We don't want, our policy is not aimed at meddling in Russian internal affairs. Our policy is not aimed at shaping a future Russia that we'd like to see. Nothing as ambitious as that. Our policy is aimed at getting Russia back to Russia, stopping this aggression with the core principles of European and international security intact, which means the full liberation of Ukraine's territory and the full realization of Ukraine's sovereignty. That's what we want. That's what we want. So hopefully the people who make decisions in Moscow will realize that the only off-ramp from this is to de-escalate and get out of Ukraine. And it is our task to make it absolutely crystal clear that if they don't take this off-ramp, then things will only get worse. That all hope for the West to lose its focus or resolve or unity is futile.
This off-ramp would be, how I view it is, there is no way they could get away now. Even if they go back to Russia, it will not be forgotten, and they will, as you said, this the trial process has begun, the point of no return. These leaders, military leaders, generals, and Putin himself, the West wants to trial them.
I think the world needs to.
Yeah.
Because I'm not naming names. This is also something for the judiciary eventually, or the international judicial process to address. Look, we're going to be defined by this. The era that will come after this war will also be defined by this. When we talk about our own societies, we underline the fact that we're societies based on the rule of law. This is the cornerstone upon which democracy, everything else in our society stands. We all know that being a society based on the rule of law does not mean that our judicial processes are perfect. It doesn't mean that every crime is solved. It doesn't mean that every criminal is punished. It does not mean perfection, but it means that we're striving towards that goal. That is the aim. We know it's not perfect, but we try to be near perfect. We also separate the judicial process from the executive and the legislative processes. We talk about a fair trial, and by saying a fair trial, we mean that it's not the government or the parliament that gets to decide whether a crime has been committed and who is guilty and who is not, and what the punishment should be. We create a fair and balanced process. Internationally, we talk about us being democracies, being those who uphold the rules-based international order. The rules-based international order. Okay. So what kind of a process, what kind of an institution, what kind of a policy do we then create to demonstrate that these weren't just words, they were not just taking symbolic steps in that direction, but no, that we are getting the results, that that the rules matter. And those who have broken rules, that there will be repercussions for breaking those rules. Not because of our government's or our parliament's decisions, but also because of the judiciary process. If we fail here, then and decide to ignore this core element of what we think has been defining us as rule of law-based societies, as those upholding the international rules-based order, if we fail, then we risk fundamentally undermining our identity and also losing our unity. Because if this idea loses its power, its credibility, and its ability to bring us together as democracies from different corners of the world, from Northern Europe to, the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and so on and so forth. If this no longer holds us together, then what will hold us together? What other thing will bring us together? It's not shared religious beliefs or historical necessary background or geographic location. It's this idea that unites us. And we all know that the 21st century will be challenging, as all centuries always are. But this too will be challenging for our way of life, for our system of governance, for the economic model that we have chosen. And I think it's widely accepted that for us to come through and succeed as a prerequisite for that, we need to maintain our unity. We cannot just be viewed as a group of mid-sized countries in Europe or then, a few larger ones on the other side of the ocean. That's going to make it so much harder for us. So my whole point here is that, yes, we know it's going to be difficult to create a judicial process, a tribunal that is perfect, that is going to necessarily soon get to all those guilty of crimes. There are a lot of dilemmas, political, legal dilemmas here, but we need to get the result. And by getting the result, I mean we need to make this a central feature of our policy, not for this month, not for this year, but until we get the results.
Until we get the results, let's say Russia pulls back to Russia, there will not be a civil war, they will not dissolve, Putin will remain in power or will be replaced by a similar-minded person, the sanctions cannot be lifted. Until we get the results, the West then will be unified against Russia until the very end.
I think the very end sounds very dramatic.
Very dramatic, yeah.
History does not end, will not end.
The end of Russia or these people.
Well, that's also, I think, a bit dramatic. But I do agree that we need to make clear that our policy is aimed at getting certain results, and that the philosophy behind the policy will not change before we get the results. And currently, the main target is a discreditation of aggression as a tool of statecraft and the defeat of this particular aggression, which can only be achieved by ensuring full territorial integrity for Ukraine and full sovereignty for Ukraine. And there are other elements here, obviously, the rebuilding of Ukraine. It's just devastating to see what is happening in 21st century Europe to peaceful cities, one after another, totally razed to the ground. Ukraine needs to be rebuilt. Ukraine has incredible potential, economic, scientific, agricultural potential with the resources that they have, the educated people, the location, but it's being devastated, absolutely devastated. So obviously, rebuilding Ukraine will have to be part of the immediate post-war compact. We also believe that actually the reconstruction of Ukraine should start already now. Estonia is already building a kindergarten in Zhytomyr province or oblast, not only with the aim of helping the families that need the kindergarten because their own kindergarten was bombed, but also in order to send a signal that we cannot just sit back and wait for the war to be over and then begin reconstruction. No. Immediate reconstruction efforts now are an important tool in demonstrating or providing the Ukrainian people with hope and demonstrating that we're not going to leave them, that we care, not only when we give speeches, but that you can tangibly feel the presence of the goodwill and the presence of the international community in Ukraine today. So what we're trying to do is also motivate, obviously, others to fasten their reconstruction efforts as well. So that, I think, should be the stated end goal. I mean, there are other elements that I didn't mention, and perhaps a few that just slipped my mind at the moment. But to get to your question, and the main point here is that, yes, absolutely, we should make clear that until we receive those results, including on the principle of accountability, that the measures that we have put in place that are aimed at getting us there need to remain in place. Absolutely. Now, this is not to say that we cannot amend things here and there, tailor measures here and there. Well, obviously we should. But the overall philosophy and the policy, the strategy should remain in place until we get what we want.
What do you think about the idea of using all of the Russian assets frozen in Europe to be allocated towards rebuilding Ukraine?
I think it's a very good idea.
Yeah.
It is a very good idea. The problem is that it's legally very, very complicated. It's legally very complicated for a number of reasons. And the more you look into it, the more complicated, the more you realize how complicated it is. Now, this said, when people say that something is complicated, oftentimes others who, hear this are deterred by it, or hear it in a way that, as if you're saying that we shouldn't look into this because it's complicated. No, to the contrary. It is precisely because it's complicated that we should spend every effort right now in trying to figure out a legal way, a constitutional way of doing it. At least that's Estonia's view. Our government has spoken publicly on this, that this is our political goal. And we've asked our government lawyers to not only look into this, but to focus on finding a legal solution. Laws are written by us. They can be amended by us. If necessary, we'll consider amending the laws so that this goal could be accomplished. We're also working at the European level, obviously, at the European Union level, I should say, to get the European experts, the experts from the European Commission, to work on this. And I know a number of, the significant numbers of lawyers that are spending a good part of their day today, also in Brussels, on finding a legal way forward here. So when we say that this is complicated, people shouldn't hear that we're not doing it, but to the contrary. Understand that we have allocated significant resources, including a significant number of lawyers, to come up with a solution. There are no impossible things. We'll find a way.
So this is, you couldn't say this is the bureaucracy of European Union, the slowness of taking the decisions because of democratic values and the needs to do the paperwork. This is the weakness of the system. No. Well, sometimes it may be. This time, it's the strength of our system that we have the.
Protect us. It protects us, obviously, but it also. I mean, we look. There is not a not a force, jokingly, obviously, as powerful as a large number of lawyers that work towards a goal, a single goal with focus. This is what we have right now. We've seen that the spokespeople of the Russian regime have reacted with a panic to these news. Clearly, they understand that this is serious. And the reason why this is serious has less to do with the amount of money that could potentially be confiscated. I think it has more to do with this being another signal that the West is not about to collapse, political will-wise. There is no just quiet going back to business as usual, ignoring the fact that what has happened and is unacceptable. I think what they, from the early days of the war, what they have hoped for is for the West to be lacking in unity, lacking in resolve and focus. Yes, maybe sanctioning Russia, but only using hollow and superficial sanctions and temporarily. I think that was the expectation. And then sooner or later, a slip back to business as usual. I think we've demonstrated over the past almost a year now that none of these things will happen. But I think there's still a level of hope in Moscow. Perhaps next week, perhaps next month, perhaps someone will call us and sign some sort of a Chamberlainian peace deal where you get supposed stability by giving away other people's freedom. Our message should be very, very clear. No, there is no hope for that to happen. I think the reason we're seeing this panic vis-a-vis the assets question is because that is another powerful signal that no, we're not about to just forget about this whole thing. This is not just our leaders giving fancy speeches. We mean it. We're actually going to defend our way of life and the most basic principles upon which we've built our own security. That when we say that the era of great powers dividing up continents is over, we mean it. When we say that we won't accept neighbors' veto powers over their neighbors' policies, we mean it. When we say that you cannot change your neighbor's borders by force, we mean it. When we say that you cannot commit war crimes, genocide, aggression, we mean it. We may not be all powerful on this planet, but we're powerful enough. and that those are the things that we mean. Not just when it's convenient, but also when we're challenged. I think it must be pretty scary to realize that the West actually means what it's been saying.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's if you look at these people listening to Putin's speeches in Kremlin, you look at these faces, they are grim. They are sitting there and they don't look up and they're afraid, and it's bizarre to look at these faces.
I think they realize that although their military is doing their best to leave Ukraine's cities into darkness, that the sort of darkness that has befallen upon Russia is deeper and more significant still. It is, I think, understandable to a good number of people, even those close to the epicenter of power in Moscow, that a society based on fear cannot succeed. That they have chosen a path which is a dead end. A dead end. That the only thing that keeps them afloat at the moment is the fear that they are creating within their own society. And we all know that fear cannot sustain a regime indefinitely.
Let's talk about the price ceiling of the oil. It was set to be 60, and correct me if I'm wrong, Russia pays about 30 plus 32, 35 USD per barrel to get it out of the ground and from transportation. So 60 USD per barrel still gives Russia about 100% profit margins.
Yeah, it's in general, you're right. Russia is making a profit still. It varies, depends on which oil field, where. I mean, the costs vary, and the market price obviously also varies. But without getting into details, overall, yes, you're absolutely right. At the same time, the price gap that was agreed upon by the European Union and the G7, our G7 partners, it does work in the sense that we have been able to cut Russia's revenues.
Yeah.
We have been able to cut Russia's revenues. We also see that the price gap works in the sense that this policy has not resulted in turmoil on the global energy markets, because that was one of the concerns. Well, by the way, everything that we've done as the European Union has been thoroughly analyzed. We're not just shooting from our hip. And if, there are concerns or aspects that should be thought through before a decision made, I can assure you these are being thought through. Not only in Brussels, but by 27 member states. Eventually, it's a compromise decision. So every positive, negative nuance gets weighed. And one of the key concerns for some before the price gap decision was the question of global oil prices. What would it do? What we've seen now is that, well, it didn't do create chaos, and yet it has managed to cut back Russia's revenues. And yet, you're right, Russia is still making a profit. So the good thing is that when we agreed to the $60 price cap, we also agreed to periodic reviews of the price cap. And this is about to start now. Actually, consultations are already ongoing. And in light of the things we've seen, in light of the things I've said, we are of the opinion indeed that we can bring it down from 60 to further cut Russia's ability to make a profit that then ends up financing its war machine.
Yeah, Russian budget 2022, I think, was the very first year in the last 20 years when the budget was in deficit. So and that is including the intense amount of money they made in March and April from the oil and gas revenues. So 2023, when we have this price ceiling and the reviewed price ceiling might be lower even, what do you think is going to happen with the Russian budget?
Well, we hope it's going to break their bank and stop their war machine. That's the intended outcome. It's one of the many things we're trying to do to raise the cost of aggression, so that they would stop. I mean, that's the message. That's the message. Statistics from authoritarian states are not necessarily always believable. So when it comes to Russia's budgetary numbers, I think they give an overall impression of where things stand, but not as in as transparent a manner as, for instance, our public information about Estonia's budget situation, deficit, surplus, or the United States is, etc., etc. We should keep in mind that there is no independent, verifiable system and no accountability in Russia except for accountability to Putin himself. So everything that they do use in their PR messaging, including these sorts of numbers. But it is true that that especially the long-term economic outlook of Russia's is dire, to say the least. The sanctions are working, and the more time goes by, the better they will work. I mean, some of the things that we've done to simply take time to give an effect. So the sanctions are working. Does that mean that we should just be content with what we've done? No, absolutely not. The war is still ongoing. The war is still ongoing. So what should we do? Well, obviously, continue increasing the cost. So there is a financial or economic aspect here that is very, very relevant, and that relates to sanctions. But there are other aspects. Political isolation of Russia on the international stage, to send a message, not just to the leadership, but to the Russian people, that the world does not accept, the world does not approve of aggression. A lot of things in this regard are out of the direct control of our governments. The way our sporting institutions behave, the Olympic Committee, other sporting organizations, how our private sector behaves. Whether the private sector realizes that doing business with Russia at a moment might be profitable in the short term, but in the long term is not even profitable from a pure, monetary point of view, but also morally unjustifiable, obviously, already today. Our entertainment business, whether it, through its activities, sends a message of isolation and condemnation to the world and to Russia or not. All of these things are important, and we should not underestimate any one of them.
And we are now at the last question, very last one, and this is about Poland, actually. For me, it looks like Poland is rearming faster than the Germany in the 1930s. And I'm glad to see it as an Estonian citizen. It makes me feel safer at this moment. But could it be worrying in the future for the Baltics and Lithuania, for example?
No, to the contrary. First of all, Poland is not the only one. Defense expenditure is going up in many other NATO allies, including in Estonia, by the way, where we will be having parliamentary elections, and in early March, security seems to become one of the key topics, and a number of political parties have come out and said that they expect the defense spending to go up and significantly above 2%. Many are, if I'm not mistaken, talking about 3% of the GDP as the new sort of baseline. So what's noteworthy here is that, if you remember, a few years ago, even being at 2% was a big deal. And a number of NATO allies weren't there yet. So we had a number of political sort of initiatives aimed at pushing allies towards that goal. A few still haven't gotten there, or let's put it correctly, a few still haven't started to move that way fast enough. But in a number of NATO countries, defense spending is going up, and that is an absolutely good thing. An absolutely good thing. It is a good thing for Poland. It's a good thing for the Baltic states. It's a good thing for NATO. Defense costs a lot of money. And this image that many have because of the 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s and the sorts of wars that were fought then, this image of war being something far away from home, affecting just maybe a tiny percentage of your population, and almost being sort of a hygienic thing that takes place from the air and the cyberspace with drones about to arrive and take care of the nastiest bits of fighting. This was a false image. It always was a false image. And now what we're seeing in Ukraine is that no, history does not end in politics. It doesn't end in warfare either. And if you want to be able to defend yourself as an alliance or as a nation state, you need to have the Air Force, the Army, the Navy. You need to have the ammunition and the ability to train your people, the ability to maintain a functioning logistics system. You need to be able to I think I already said, train people, etc., collect and analyze intelligence. And this is extremely costly. And you can't just be having 2 days' worth of ammunition in your warehouses. Look at what the Ukrainians are using. Look at the level of assistance they require. And most observers, from a neutral point of view, would today argue that, well, Ukraine needs more than what the West has been able to provide. And the West's assistance oftentimes, again, takes time for us to make the decisions, and then it takes additional time for us to actually get the weapon systems into Ukraine. It takes time for the Ukrainians to train on new weapon systems. That's all understandable, but just look at the quantity of the weapons that is necessary. So yes, we should be not only talking about security and defense, we should be investing in defense. And in the difficult 21st century for Europe, it is not doable with below 2% defense spending.
I do agree very much so. Thank you very much, Jonatan Vseviov. Thank you for coming to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
My friends, this has been a very interesting episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini.